The smoke rose in 3 sharp bursts against the clear Nevada sky. Each burst lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then nothing. Silence. 30 seconds of absolute stillness while Jacob Hollings held his breath, watching the distant peak where the signal had originated. His pocket watch ticked in his hand. 28 seconds. 29. 30. 2 more bursts, shorter this time, 2 seconds each. Then the fire went dark. Jacob had been riding the Pony Express route between Fort Laramie and Salt Lake City for 3 months. He'd carried messages, mail, and intelligence across some of the most dangerous territory in North America. He'd been shot at twice, had 2 horses killed under him, and once rode 40 miles through a blizzard that should have killed him. He thought he understood communication, understood urgency, understood what it meant to move information fast enough to matter. He was wrong. What he was watching that Tuesday morning in June 1862 would prove everything he thought he knew about frontier communication was obsolete. The message being transmitted through smoke and fire would travel over 200 miles across terrain that would break a horse and kill a rider. It would cross mountain ranges where no telegraph wire had ever been strung and probably never would be. It would navigate through valleys, bypass obstacles, route around interference, and arrive at its destination with perfect accuracy. And it would do all of this in 4 hours. The telegraph line that ran parallel to Jacob's route, the most advanced communication technology the United States possessed in 1862, the miracle of modern science that had revolutionized warfare and commerce, would take 6 hours to send the same information. And that was assuming every relay station was manned, every operator was competent, every connection was solid, and the weather cooperated. On a bad day, and there were plenty of bad days, the telegraph might not transmit the message at all. Jacob didn't know what the message said. He couldn't read the smoke signals any more than he could read Chinese characters or hieroglyphics. But he'd learned to recognize when signals were being sent. He'd learned to watch for the patterns, the timing, the deliberate structure that separated communication from random campfire smoke. And he'd learned that when Shoshone signal fires started talking, something important was happening. What he didn't know, what none of the white settlers in the region understood, was that the system he was watching represented engineering sophistication that took centuries to develop. The signal operators weren't making smoke by throwing blankets over fires like he'd seen in dime novels. They were executing precise protocols, using carefully prepared materials, applying atmospheric science that wouldn't be formally described in Western textbooks for another 50 years, coordinating across a network of relay stations positioned with surveyor-level precision, and encoding information through a multi-dimensional system that packed more data into 5 minutes of smoke than most people could write in an hour. The military column whose movements were being reported was 3 days' ride to the east. A force of 240 cavalry and infantry, 2 supply wagons, and a mountain howitzer moving west along the Oregon Trail with orders to secure the route against Indian raids. The column commander thought he was moving in secret. He'd sent scouts ahead to watch for observers. He'd kept his force off the main trail, using secondary routes that should have been impossible to monitor. He'd taken every precaution his training and experience suggested. None of it mattered. The Shoshone had spotted his column within 6 hours of it entering their territory. They'd assessed its size, composition, direction, and apparent intent within 12 hours. And now, 4 hours after the decision to warn Allied bands, that intelligence was spreading across 200 miles of mountain territory at a speed that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand what they were seeing. By sunset, 18 separate Shoshone encampments would receive that warning. Families would begin moving their camps to positions that kept them out of the military's path. Hunting parties would be recalled. Young men who might have been inclined to test themselves against the soldiers would be counseled by elders who understood that this particular fight wasn't worth the cost. And the military column would pass through the territory encountering nothing but empty campsites and cold fire pits, never knowing they'd been tracked every mile of their journey. The intelligence advantage was absolute, and it existed because of technology that white settlers either didn't recognize as technology or dismissed as primitive signaling unworthy of serious attention. Jacob watched for another 30 minutes as answering signals began to appear on distant peaks. One mountain, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession as the relay network activated. Each station received the signal, interpreted it, and retransmitted it to the next station in the chain. The coordination was flawless. No station missed its timing. No signal was garbled or lost. The information flowed across the landscape like water finding its path, inevitable and unstoppable. He pulled out his notebook and tried to sketch what he was seeing. 3 peaks with smoke. Timing intervals he couldn't quite capture accurately. Patterns that seemed deliberate, but whose meaning escaped him entirely. He'd been keeping these notes for weeks, trying to understand the system, trying to find the logic that would let him decode the signals. It was futile. He was trying to learn a language by watching people's mouths move without hearing the sounds. The signals weren't a simple code, where 1 puff meant yes and 2 puffs meant no. They were a complete communication system with grammar, syntax, and semantic layers that required years of training to master. You couldn't learn it by watching any more than you could learn to read music by staring at sheet music without understanding what the symbols meant. But Jacob kept trying because what he was witnessing frightened him in ways he didn't fully articulate even to himself. The Pony Express was supposed to be fast. He rode hard, changed horses at stations spaced for maximum speed, pushed through conditions that stopped normal travelers. He thought he was at the cutting edge of rapid communication, but watching those smoke signals propagate across distances he couldn't ride in a day, he understood viscerally that he was obsolete. The system he served was being outperformed by people his civilization classified as savages living in the Stone Age. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could Indians with no writing, no machines, no formal education possess communication technology superior to the telegraph? It violated everything he'd been taught about progress and civilization. The superiority of Western technology was supposed to be self-evident, proven through the conquest of wilderness and the advancement of settlement. Yet here was evidence that the superiority was illusion, or at least incomplete. The telegraph was impressive in cities, along established routes, across controlled territory. But out here, in contested land, where infrastructure was vulnerability and visibility was death, the Indigenous communication system was simply better, faster, more reliable, more secure, more adaptable. Jacob didn't want to believe it. Believing it meant questioning assumptions that shaped his entire worldview. So he watched, made his notes, and tried to convince himself that what he was seeing wasn't as sophisticated as it appeared. There had to be a simple explanation. The signals must be basic. The coordination must be coincidence. The speed must be exaggerated by his imperfect observation. He was wrong on every count. But he wouldn't learn that for years. And by then, the system he was watching would be largely destroyed, its operators displaced or dead, its knowledge fragmenting into oral traditions that anthropologists would struggle to reconstruct from incomplete memories of elders who'd learned the system in their youth, before the world changed forever. This is exactly what we explore here at Old West Archives. The moments when Indigenous technology exceeded Western systems in ways that history rarely acknowledges, and the uncomfortable truths about what was lost when cultural arrogance prevented learning from conquered peoples. If stories like this captivate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover the engineering achievements that shaped the American frontier. And tell us in the comments, what Indigenous innovation do you find most impressive? Now, to understand what Jacob was watching that morning, and why it represented engineering more sophisticated than he could recognize, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand how the Shoshone signal fire system actually worked. The smoke signal network of the Shoshone and other Great Basin tribes wasn't invented in the 1800s. It wasn't even invented in the 1700s. Archaeological evidence and oral traditions suggest the system's roots extended back at least 5 centuries, possibly much longer. By the time European settlers began pushing into the region in the 1840s and 1850s, they were encountering a mature technology that had been refined through hundreds of generations of use, testing, failure, and incremental improvement. The foundation was observation, deep, systematic, multi-generational observation of how smoke behaved under different atmospheric conditions. The Shoshone lived in an environment where atmospheric conditions varied dramatically. Desert basins and mountain peaks. Temperature extremes from below zero in winter to over 100 degrees in summer. Dry air and humid air. Calm conditions and violent winds. Every possible variable that affected smoke behavior was present in their territory, and they had centuries to study those variables. They learned that smoke rising from a fire wasn't random. It followed physical laws. Those laws weren't written down in equations and textbooks, but they were understood through pattern recognition and practical experimentation. Smoke rose because it was hotter than the surrounding air. The speed of that rise depended on temperature differential. Smoke spread horizontally when wind caught it. The distance it would travel before dissipating depended on particle size, air humidity, atmospheric stability, and dozens of other factors that interacted in complex ways. Western science would eventually formalize these observations into fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, and atmospheric physics. But the Shoshone didn't need formal science. They needed practical knowledge that produced reliable results. And they developed that knowledge through the same method that produced every other human technology before the modern era. Try things, observe what happens, remember what works, teach the next generation, repeat for centuries. The signal stations were the first visible manifestation of this knowledge. These weren't random hilltops someone climbed when they wanted to send a message. They were carefully selected positions, chosen for specific characteristics that made them optimal for signal transmission and reception. Site selection began with visibility. A signal station needed line of sight to at least 2 other stations, preferably 3 or 4. This created redundancy in the network. If one relay path was blocked by weather or terrain features, alternate paths existed. The survey work required to position these stations was substantial. You couldn't just climb any hill and hope it worked. You had to know the precise locations of other stations, understand the sight lines between them, account for terrain features that might block visibility at certain angles, and ensure that the station could be reached and supplied by operators who would need to maintain it. Modern archaeological surveys using laser mapping technology have identified dozens of former signal stations throughout Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. The positioning shows consistent patterns that reveal deliberate planning. Stations are spaced at intervals of 15 to 25 miles, depending on terrain elevation and atmospheric clarity typical to the region. They're positioned on ridge lines, where prevailing wind patterns are predictable. They're located near water sources when possible, but not so close that they're vulnerable to ambush by enemies approaching along stream valleys. The strategic thinking embedded in the station network is sophisticated enough that modern military communication planners recognize it as sound practice. Each station featured specific infrastructure. The fire pit wasn't just a circle of rocks, it was an engineered structure optimized for rapid activation, efficient fuel consumption, and smoke production that could be precisely controlled. Archaeological excavations at preserved sites show consistent design features across stations separated by hundreds of miles and spanning multiple generations of construction. The pit diameter was typically 18 to 24 inches. This wasn't arbitrary. Smaller pits produced insufficient smoke volume. Larger pits consumed fuel inefficiently and produced smoke that was harder to control precisely. The depth was critical, approximately 12 inches deep. This depth created a thermal environment where coals could be maintained at high temperature with minimal fuel, producing little smoke during standby periods, but capable of generating large volumes of smoke quickly when fuel was added. The pit was lined with flat stones that served multiple functions. They reflected heat back into the fire, increasing thermal efficiency. They protected the pit from erosion caused by repeated heating and cooling, and they created a thermal mass that helped maintain stable coal bed temperature over long periods. The specific stone types varied by location, but operators consistently chose stones that could withstand repeated extreme heating without cracking. Granite and certain basalts were preferred. Limestone and sandstone, which could shatter when heated rapidly, were avoided. Around the pit, operators built windbreaks from stone or wood. These weren't walls that blocked visibility. They were carefully positioned barriers that protected the fire from wind that would scatter smoke before it could form coherent patterns, while still allowing the operator to be visible to approaching observers and to maintain watch on the horizons where incoming signals would appear. The windbreak positioning showed understanding of local wind patterns. In areas where prevailing winds came from consistent directions, windbreaks were asymmetrical, providing maximum protection from the dominant wind direction while remaining open to directions where wind was rarely problematic. Near each station, operators maintained fuel caches. This is where the engineering became particularly sophisticated. The fuel wasn't just whatever wood happened to be nearby. It was carefully selected, prepared, and stored to produce specific smoke characteristics under different conditions. The primary fuel was sagebrush, which dominated the landscape throughout the Great Basin. But not any sagebrush. Operators harvested plants of specific ages and at specific times of year. Fresh green sagebrush with high moisture content produced thick white smoke that was highly visible but dissipated quickly. This was ideal for short-range signals in clear weather, where maximum visibility was more important than signal persistence. Dried sagebrush produced thinner, grayer smoke that traveled further and remained visible longer before dissipating. This was preferred for long-range relay signals, where the smoke needed to remain coherent over 20-plus mile distances. The drying process was controlled. Sagebrush harvested in late summer and dried in shade for 6 to 8 weeks produced optimal characteristics. Operators learned through experience that plants dried too quickly in direct sun produced smoke that was too thin, while plants dried too slowly in damp conditions produced irregular smoke that was difficult to control. For special applications, other materials were added. Wet grasses produced dark gray to black smoke that stood out dramatically against clear skies. This was used for emergency signals where maximum visibility was critical. Pine boughs produced darker, oilier smoke that cut through mist and light rain better than standard sagebrush smoke. Cedar produced smoke with distinctive characteristics that some tribes used for specific message categories. Essentially, a meta-encoding where the fuel type itself carried information about message priority or category. The fuel storage shows attention to detail that reveals how seriously the system was maintained. Fuel was stored in sealed containers, typically leather bags or tightly woven baskets coated with pitch, to keep it dry and ready for immediate use. Moisture-damaged fuel produced unreliable smoke that could garble signals. At important relay stations, operators maintained multiple fuel types in sufficient quantities to maintain signal operations for extended periods. Some caches, excavated by archaeologists, contained enough prepared fuel to sustain signal operations for weeks without resupply. The fire itself required careful management. Signal fires weren't built from scratch when a message needed to be sent. By the time you gathered fuel, built a fire, and waited for it to develop sufficient heat to produce usable smoke, 20 minutes might have passed. In a relay system where timing was critical, that delay was unacceptable. Instead, operators maintained a base fire that burned continuously during operational hours, typically from dawn to dusk during normal conditions, or continuously during periods of heightened alert. The base fire was small, using hardwood that produced steady heat with minimal smoke. The coal bed was maintained at high temperature but with little visible flame. From a distance, even from a few hundred yards, the station would appear inactive. No smoke, no obvious fire, nothing to draw attention. When a signal needed to be sent, the operator added prepared fuel to this coal bed in precisely measured amounts. The response was nearly instantaneous. Dry sagebrush hitting hot coals produced visible smoke within 5 to 10 seconds. The volume could be controlled by the amount of fuel added. The duration could be controlled by timing the fuel addition, and the smoke characteristics could be varied by choosing different fuel types from the prepared caches. This rapid activation capability was essential for relay operations. When an operator spotted an incoming signal, they needed to interpret it, prepare to relay it, and begin transmission within 30 to 60 seconds to maintain the network's overall speed. The fire management system that made this possible was the result of generations of refinement. Early attempts probably used fires built from scratch, which meant slow relay times and limited network speed. At some point, operators developed the maintained coal bed technique, which reduced reaction time dramatically. That innovation, passed down and standardized across the network, transformed the system from slow signaling to rapid communication. The smoke patterns themselves were where information was encoded. This wasn't a simple system where one puff meant danger and two puffs meant all clear. It was a multi-dimensional encoding system that used duration, spacing, number, repetition, and timing to pack substantial information into brief transmission sequences. The basic structure was hierarchical. Messages began with a category identifier that told receiving operators what type of information was being transmitted. This allowed operators to prioritize attention and prepare for the specific encoding protocols associated with that message category. 3 short bursts, approximately 2 seconds each with 2-second spacing, indicated military intelligence. This was the highest priority category because it represented immediate tactical threats or opportunities. When operators saw this opening sequence, they knew to focus completely on the incoming signal, prepare to relay it immediately, and watch for confirmation signals from adjacent stations. 5 short bursts indicated natural disaster or emergency: fire, flood, avalanche, severe storm approaching. This category had slightly lower priority than military intelligence, but required immediate relay because lives were at risk from non-human threats. A single long burst, lasting 10 seconds, indicated social coordination, peaceful travel by allied groups, resource information, gathering announcements. This was lowest priority and might not be relayed immediately if higher priority traffic was using the network. Within each category, the subsequent signals encoded specific information. For military intelligence, the encoding was particularly sophisticated because the information was most tactically valuable and most time-sensitive. After the 3-burst category identifier, operators would send additional signals indicating force size. A single burst following the identifier meant small party, 5 to 10 individuals. 2 bursts meant war party, 20 to 50 warriors. 3 bursts meant major force, 100 or more individuals. 4 bursts meant army-scale force, several hundred or more with supply trains and heavy weapons. The spacing between the category identifier and the force size signals encoded distance information. Immediate transmission with no gap meant the threat was close, within 1 day's travel. A 15-second gap meant moderate distance, 2 to 3 days away. A 30-second gap meant distant, 4 to 5 days away. A full minute gap meant intelligence about movements far enough away that immediate tactical response wasn't required, but strategic awareness was valuable. Direction was encoded through a combination of signal duration and position within the sequence. The Shoshone divided the horizon into 8 primary directions, corresponding roughly to cardinal and intercardinal compass points. Each direction had a numeric code from 1 to 8, represented by the number of direction signals sent. Short duration signals, 1-second bursts, indicated precise direction. Long duration signals, 4-second bursts, indicated approximate direction or movements across multiple directional sectors. So a complete military intelligence signal might look like this: 3 short bursts, military intelligence. Wait 15 seconds. Threat is 2 to 3 days away. 2 short bursts, war party size, 20 to 50 individuals. Wait 5 seconds. 3 short bursts, moving in direction 3, roughly northeast. Wait 5 seconds. 4 long bursts, moving toward direction 4, roughly east. suggesting a ranging pattern rather than direct march. An experienced operator could interpret this entire sequence in under 2 minutes and relay it to the next station in the network within another minute. The information transmitted was substantial. Hostile war party of significant size, currently 2 to 3 days away, moving in a northeast to east pattern, suggesting scouting or raiding rather than direct assault on known targets. Based on this intelligence, Shoshone bands in the likely path could relocate. Hunting parties could be recalled, and strategic decisions could be made with time to implement them before the threat arrived. The encoding system was even more nuanced than this basic framework suggests. Operators could add modifier signals that provided additional context. A very short burst, less than 1 second, added to a sequence indicated uncertainty. The information was based on distant observation or indirect evidence rather than direct sighting. A very long burst, longer than 5 seconds, indicated high confidence. Multiple observers, close sighting, clear observation conditions. Repetition added another layer of meaning. A signal sequence transmitted once was normal priority. The same sequence transmitted twice in succession was urgent. Transmitted 3 times was emergency, immediate threat requiring immediate response. This repetition protocol allowed the network to handle both routine intelligence sharing and crisis communication using the same basic signal vocabulary. Weather information used different encoding because the information type was different. Weather signals began with 5 short bursts to indicate the emergency/natural event category, followed by specific patterns that described atmospheric conditions, severity, timing, and expected duration. Cloud patterns that predicted storms had specific signal representations. Operators observed cloud types, formations, movement patterns, and used those observations to predict weather with accuracy that impressed even skeptical white settlers. High, thin clouds moving from the southwest typically preceded warm storms. Low, dark clouds building rapidly from the northwest meant cold fronts and potentially severe weather. The signal system encoded these observations, transmitting weather intelligence that allowed dispersed bands to prepare for storms, sometimes a full day before they arrived. Resource information, game movements, water sources, seasonal gathering opportunities, used the social coordination category with additional encoding for resource type and location. Large game herds, particularly bison, had dedicated signal patterns because coordinating hunts for such mobile resources required network-scale communication. When scouts spotted a bison herd, they could signal its location, direction, and approximate size. Allied bands within a day's travel could position themselves to intercept the herd, coordinating their efforts to maximize hunting success while minimizing conflict over the resource. The relay system that moved these signals across hundreds of miles was itself an engineering achievement that required precise coordination and trained personnel. Each relay station needed operators who understood the signal protocols, could maintain watch on multiple horizons simultaneously, could activate their fire and transmit relayed signals within 1 minute of receiving incoming signals, and could make judgment calls about when to use alternate relay paths if primary paths were blocked. The operators worked in shifts during normal conditions. One person maintaining the fire and watching primary horizons, another resting or handling station maintenance, rotating every few hours to prevent fatigue that could cause missed signals. During heightened alert periods, multiple operators would be active simultaneously, with specialized roles, one managing fire and transmission, others maintaining watch on different horizons, one preparing backup fuel and managing supplies. The watch discipline was remarkable. Operators needed to spot smoke signals at distances up to 20 miles. At that distance, smoke was often barely visible, a slight discoloration against sky or terrain, appearing and disappearing depending on atmospheric conditions and viewing angle. Operators developed techniques for scanning horizons systematically, using peripheral vision, which is more sensitive to movement and contrast than central vision, and recognizing the characteristic patterns that distinguished signal smoke from background haze, clouds, or random fire smoke. When an operator spotted an incoming signal, they would focus attention on that horizon sector, watching the complete signal sequence while mentally decoding it. Simultaneously, they would prepare to relay the signal, positioning themselves at their fire, selecting appropriate fuel, and timing their relay to begin within seconds of the incoming signal completing. The timing precision required for effective relay operations was substantial. If every relay station added a 2-minute delay, 1 minute to fully receive and decode the signal, 1 minute to prepare and transmit the relay, a message passing through 10 relay stations would take 20 minutes just in relay delays, not counting the time the smoke itself took to travel between stations. At 15-mile station spacing and smoke travel speed dependent on wind, but typically requiring 3 to 5 minutes per leg, a 150-mile transmission would take 30 to 50 minutes for smoke travel plus 20 minutes for relay delays, roughly 50 to 70 minutes total. But the system regularly achieved better performance than this calculation suggests. Operators didn't wait for complete signal sequences to finish before beginning relay preparations. An experienced operator could identify the message category from the opening bursts, begin preparing the relay fire, and often could start transmitting the relay even before the incoming signal completed. This parallel processing reduced relay delays to 30 to 45 seconds at each station, rather than 2 full minutes. The result was network performance that consistently moved messages 200 miles in 4 to 5 hours under good conditions. In urgent situations, with experienced operators at every station and favorable atmospheric conditions, the system could approach 50 miles per hour effective transmission speed across mountainous terrain with no physical infrastructure beyond the fire pits themselves. Compare this to the telegraph. Point-to-point telegraph transmission was essentially instantaneous. Electrical signals traveled at nearly the speed of light through copper wire. But that speed was deceptive because it only applied to transmission between 2 stations. Relaying a message through a telegraph network required human intervention at each relay station. The operator had to receive the complete message, transcribe it, then retransmit it to the next station. An experienced telegraph operator could send approximately 25 words per minute. Receiving and transcribing was slightly faster, maybe 30 words per minute for skilled operators. So a 100-word message required roughly 4 minutes to send, 3 minutes to receive and transcribe, then 4 more minutes to relay to the next station. That's 11 minutes per relay station just for the transmission process. Add in human factors and the delays increased. Operators needed breaks. Stations weren't staffed 24/7 in remote areas. Messages arriving outside normal hours might wait until operators returned to their posts in the morning. Equipment malfunctions required diagnosis and repair, which could take hours or days. Telegraph lines failed constantly due to weather, animal damage, or sabotage, requiring crews to locate and fix the breaks. A military report from 1864, analyzing telegraph performance in the Western Territories, found that messages requiring relay through multiple stations took an average of 5 to 8 hours to transmit across 200 miles, with significant variance depending on time of day, weather conditions, and how many stations were fully staffed and operational. In comparison, smoke signals covering the same distance averaged 4 to 5 hours, with much lower variance because the system was less dependent on infrastructure that could fail. The weather resistance of smoke signals versus telegraph was particularly dramatic. Telegraph lines failed catastrophically in conditions that barely inconvenienced smoke signal operations. Rain caused electrical shorts and ground faults that stopped transmission until lines dried out or damaged sections were bypassed. Ice storms snapped wires and brought down poles, sometimes destroying miles of line that required days to repair. Lightning strikes burned out equipment at stations, requiring replacement parts that might not be available in remote locations. High winds physically damaged infrastructure, and heavy snow made line repairs impossible until weather cleared. Smoke signals operated in all of these conditions. Rain actually improved visibility in some cases, creating contrast between smoke and dark sky. Operators learned to use wetter fuels in rain, producing darker smoke that cut through precipitation. Ice and snow were irrelevant to a fire-based system. Lightning was a danger to operators, but not to the system itself. There was no delicate equipment to damage. Wind, which destroyed telegraph infrastructure, was the ally of smoke signals, carrying them faster and further. Only a few weather conditions significantly impaired smoke signals. Heavy fog reduced visibility, but operators developed protocols using different fuel types to create darker, more visible smoke that cut through mist better than standard signals. Extreme high winds, above 40 to 50 miles per hour, could scatter smoke so rapidly that coherent patterns became difficult to maintain. But operators learned to compensate by creating larger volume smoke bursts that would remain partially visible even after wind fragmentation. And truly severe weather, blizzards, dust storms, that reduced visibility to near zero, stopped smoke signals just as it stopped all other forms of communication. But these extreme conditions were rare, and the smoke signal network was operational in conditions that routinely stopped telegraph transmission. The security advantages of smoke signals over telegraph were perhaps most significant from a military perspective. Telegraph messages could be intercepted trivially. Anyone who cut the line and attached a receiving device could read every transmission. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces routinely tapped enemy telegraph lines to gather intelligence. The technique required minimal equipment and skill, just access to the physical wire. Smoke signal interception was nearly impossible without deep knowledge of the encoding system. An observer could see that signals were being sent, but without understanding the tribal-specific encoding protocols, the information remained secure. The signals weren't encrypted in the modern cryptographic sense. There was no key that could be mathematically cracked. They were encoded in a cultural context that required years of training to understand. Different tribal groups used different encoding systems. The Shoshone protocols were distinct from Crow signals, which differed from Cheyenne and Lakota systems. Some signals were standardized for intertribal communication, basic danger alerts, peaceful travel notifications. But detailed tactical intelligence used tribe-specific codes that were effectively unbreakable to outsiders. Even if you captured a signal operator and interrogated them about signal meanings, the knowledge you'd gain would be limited. Individual signals could be explained, but understanding how the signals composed into complex messages required understanding the conceptual framework that organized the information. It was like trying to understand mathematics by having someone define what numbers mean. The definitions are meaningless without the underlying mathematical framework that gives them relationship and utility. U.S. military forces encountered this security advantage repeatedly during Indian Wars campaigns. They knew smoke signals were being used to coordinate indigenous responses. They could see the signals, but they couldn't read them. Attempts to create false signals to confuse or deceive failed because commanders didn't understand the encoding well enough to create believable fake messages. The few attempts documented in military reports show hopelessly crude signal patterns that indigenous operators would have immediately recognized as gibberish or enemy action. The training required to become a signal operator was extensive and began in childhood. This wasn't casual knowledge passed on through occasional instruction. It was serious education that produced specialists with rare and valuable skills. Young Shoshone children learned about smoke and fire from their earliest years through normal, daily activities. Everyone in the culture understood fire management at a basic level. It was essential survival knowledge. But those who showed particular aptitude or interest would begin receiving more specialized instruction by age 7 or 8. Initial training focused on understanding smoke behavior. Children would watch small fires in controlled settings, learning to observe how different fuels produced different smoke characteristics, how wind affected smoke travel, how atmospheric conditions changed visibility. This was play as much as education. Children would compete to create specific smoke patterns or to predict how smoke would behave under different conditions. But through the play, they were developing intuitive understanding of physical principles that underlay the signal system. By age 10 or 12, promising students would begin learning the signal alphabet. This was formal instruction from experienced operators who would teach the standard patterns, timing protocols, and encoding systems. The teaching was patient and repetitive. Students would practice creating specific signal sequences until they could produce them accurately without thinking. They would learn to identify signals at a distance, watching experienced operators conduct actual transmissions and being tested on their ability to decode what they observed. The cognitive load was substantial. An experienced operator needed to have memorized hundreds of signal patterns, understand dozens of encoding protocols for different message types, and be able to execute them accurately under pressure when timing was critical. This is comparable to the training required for telegraph operators, who needed to memorize Morse code, develop sending and receiving skills, and learn the operational protocols for their telegraph company. But smoke signal training had advantages over telegraph training. Students learned in context, at actual signal stations, with real-world feedback about whether their signals were being received and interpreted correctly at distant stations. Telegraph operators trained in offices using abstract letter codes that bore no intuitive relationship to the information being transmitted. Smoke signal operators learned a system that made logical sense within its cultural framework once you understood the underlying principles. By their late teens, students who had shown consistent aptitude would begin taking shifts as operators at actual signal stations, initially supervised by experienced operators who could correct mistakes and provide guidance. The progression from supervised practice to independent operation took several more years. By their early 20s, successful students would be trusted to operate stations alone or would be training the next generation of students. The cultural significance of signal operators was substantial. They held specialized knowledge that was essential to community survival. During conflicts, signal operators might make the difference between advance warning that allowed families to reach safety and surprise attack that resulted in casualties. Operators were recognized specialists, similar to skilled hunters or medicine practitioners, whose abilities were valued and whose training represented significant community investment. But the training went beyond signal protocols. Operators needed deep understanding of atmospheric science to predict smoke behavior under different conditions. They needed to read weather patterns to understand when signals would be viable and when atmospheric conditions would make transmission unreliable. They needed to understand the relay network geography, where stations were positioned, which stations were in line of sight from which locations, how to route signals through alternate paths if primary routes were blocked. They needed physical stamina to maintain watch for hours without letting attention drift. They needed discipline to maintain stations during long periods when no signals were sent, but readiness had to be maintained for signals that might come without warning. And they needed judgment to make operational decisions when situations didn't match standard protocols, when to repeat signals if acknowledgement wasn't received, when to use alternate relay paths, how to adapt to equipment failures or fuel shortages. The training produced experts with intuitive understanding of principles that Western science was only beginning to formalize. When military engineers or surveyors encountered indigenous signal operators and attempted to understand their methods, they often came away frustrated. The operators couldn't explain, in scientific terminology, why specific techniques worked. They just knew they worked because generations of practice had proven it. The knowledge was embedded in practical expertise that was difficult to articulate to outsiders who didn't share the cultural context. This made knowledge transfer problematic when settlers tried to learn smoke signal techniques. They could observe the surface mechanics, fire, fuel, smoke patterns, but without the deep understanding of atmospheric conditions, timing protocols, and encoding systems, their attempts produced crude approximations that lacked the precision and reliability of indigenous operations. Some frontier trading posts and military outposts attempted to adopt smoke signal systems for their own use. These adaptations were typically simplified to basic signals: fire for danger, no fire for all clear, different smoke colors for different alert levels. Even these basic signals provided advantage. A trading post that could warn approaching wagons of danger saved lives and protected valuable cargo. But the sophisticated relay networks, the complex encoding systems, the network coordination that allowed messages to travel hundreds of miles in hours, that level of implementation was essentially impossible for settler populations. They lacked the trained operators, the established station infrastructure, the cultural knowledge that made the system work at full capability. The few documented cases where settlers successfully integrated smoke signals into their operations involved direct partnerships with indigenous scouts or guides who maintained connections to traditional knowledge systems. Fort Laramie employed Shoshone scouts who would relay intelligence received through smoke signal networks to military commanders. Some trading posts paid indigenous operators to maintain signal stations that would warn of approaching hostile parties or coordinate with hunting expeditions. But these were collaborative arrangements that acknowledged indigenous expertise rather than independent settler implementation of the technology. The recognition was pragmatic rather than respectful. The military and traders needed the intelligence advantages the signal system provided and were willing to pay for access to those advantages. But acknowledgement of the system's sophistication rarely translated into cultural respect or credit for the engineering achievement it represented. The comparison to telegraph technology becomes even more interesting when we examine what happened operationally when both systems existed in the same territory during the 1860s. This wasn't purely theoretical comparison. For a period of roughly 15 years, both systems operated simultaneously, and we have documentary evidence of their relative performance. The telegraph began reaching Nevada and Utah territories in the early 1860s. The transcontinental telegraph was completed in October 1861, creating the first electrical communication link between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. This was celebrated as a technological miracle that unified the nation and made the Pony Express obsolete almost overnight. The narrative was one of inevitable progress, modern technology replacing primitive methods. But on the ground, in actual operational use, the reality was more complex. The telegraph was revolutionary for certain applications: long-distance communication between cities, coordination of railroad operations, transmission of market information for financial speculation. For these uses, the telegraph was transformative. But for tactical intelligence in contested territory, the smoke signal networks often performed better. There's a documented incident from August 1862 where both systems were used to transmit similar intelligence about Shoshone band movements. A military patrol spotted a large gathering of Shoshone families in western Nevada and sent a telegraph message to Fort Churchill, approximately 180 miles away, requesting orders about whether to attempt contact or maintain distance. The telegraph message, transmitted at 11 a.m., arrived at Fort Churchill at 4:30 p.m. 5.5 hours of transmission time through 4 relay stations. The Shoshone, aware they'd been observed by the military patrol, sent smoke signals informing Allied bands of the military presence and the patrol's apparent intentions. Those signals, transmitted at approximately the same time as the telegraph message, reached bands 200 miles away within 4 hours. By the time the telegraph message reached Fort Churchill and orders were formulated and sent back to the patrol, the Shoshone bands had already repositioned based on intelligence that traveled faster through smoke signals than through the most advanced technological communication system available to the United States military. The patrol commander's report, preserved in military archives, noted with frustration that the hostiles possess uncanny awareness of our movements and intentions, seemingly coordinating across vast distances with speed that our telegraph cannot match in these remote regions. This wasn't an isolated incident. Military reports from the 1860s and 1870s contain numerous references to Indigenous forces demonstrating intelligence and coordination capabilities that seemed impossible given their presumed lack of advanced communication. What commanders didn't understand was that advanced was a culturally relative term. The telegraph was advanced within Western technological frameworks. Smoke signals were advanced within indigenous engineering traditions. Both were sophisticated solutions to communication challenges, but optimized for different operational environments. The smoke signal advantage was particularly pronounced during bad weather. An October 1863 report from Fort Bridger noted that a severe thunderstorm had knocked out telegraph communication across southern Wyoming for 3 days, while lightning strikes damaged equipment and heavy rain caused ground faults. During the same period, Shoshone and Ute bands coordinated movements and resource sharing using smoke signals that operated normally despite the storms. The contrast led one officer to write that the savages demonstrate greater technological resilience than our vaunted modern systems. The security advantage became apparent during combat operations. In 1864, during Colonel Chivington's campaigns in Colorado, military telegraph messages were sometimes intercepted by Southern sympathizers or Confederate agents who had learned to tap lines. Tactical plans telegraphed to field units were compromised, leading to ambushes or failed operations. By contrast, Indigenous forces coordinating through smoke signals maintained information security that the U.S. military couldn't penetrate. Chivington's reports complained that enemy forces coordinate their movements through methods we cannot intercept or decode. The strategic implications were profound. The U.S. military was fighting with longer decision cycles than their opponents. Intelligence gathered by scouts had to be carried by courier or transmitted through telegraph networks that were unreliable in remote areas. Orders flowed through hierarchical command structures that added delays at each level. The time from observation to decision to action was measured in days. Indigenous forces operating with smoke signal networks worked with decision cycles measured in hours. A military column would be spotted. Within hours, that intelligence would reach decision makers who could coordinate responses across multiple bands. Strategic decisions could be implemented while the military column was still unaware it had been detected. This intelligence advantage translated into tactical superiority that compensated for disadvantages in weapons, numbers, and supplies. The advantage wasn't unlimited. Smoke signals worked best over line-of-sight distances and territories where relay stations could be maintained. The system was less effective in heavily forested regions, where mountains and trees blocked visibility between stations. It was vulnerable to systematic destruction of relay stations if an enemy force could identify and target them. And it required territorial control sufficient to maintain the station network and train operators. As U.S. military pressure increased during the 1860s and 1870s, these vulnerabilities became critical. The systematic displacement of indigenous populations from traditional territories disrupted the geographic knowledge that underpinned signal networks. When bands were forced onto reservations far from ancestral lands, they lost access to the established relay stations, the carefully surveyed positions, the maintained infrastructure that made the system work. The social disruption was equally damaging. Signal operator training took years and required stable communities where elders could teach younger generations. Reservation policies deliberately disrupted these social structures. Children were sent to boarding schools designed to erase indigenous cultural knowledge. The systematic destruction of traditional lifeways made it impossible to maintain the training pipelines that produced skilled operators. By 1875, most of the smoke signal networks that had operated for centuries across the Great Basin and Rocky Mountains had ceased functioning as coordinated systems. The knowledge survived in fragments: elders who remembered the protocols, families who maintained oral traditions, but the operational networks were gone. The telegraph had won, not because it was superior, but because the social and political systems that maintained its competition had been deliberately destroyed. The loss wasn't recognized as loss by most settlers and military personnel. The dominant narrative was that progress had triumphed over primitive methods. The telegraph represented civilization, order, and modern technology. Smoke signals represented savagery, backwardness, and obsolescence. The fact that smoke signals had demonstrably outperformed telegraph in specific applications within specific contexts didn't matter. The cultural narrative required that Western technology be superior, so evidence of indigenous technological sophistication was dismissed or ignored. But some observers recognized what had been lost. There are scattered accounts from military officers, surveyors, and traders who had directly experienced the effectiveness of smoke signal networks and understood that something remarkable had been destroyed. An 1878 report from a surveying expedition in Nevada noted that the signal fire stations we occasionally encounter in mountain passes represent a communication system whose sophistication we are only beginning to appreciate now that it has largely ceased operation. Anthropologists who studied indigenous cultures in the late 1800s and early 1900s attempted to document smoke signal knowledge before it disappeared entirely. These ethnographic records are incomplete, filtered through cultural assumptions of researchers who often didn't fully understand what they were documenting. But they preserved enough information for later researchers to reconstruct the basic principles of how the systems worked. The most detailed early documentation came from anthropologist Julian Stewart, who worked with Shoshone communities in Nevada and Utah during the 1920s and 1930s. Stewart interviewed elders who had learned signal operations in their youth before the networks were disrupted. His notes describe signal patterns, encoding protocols, station locations, and operational procedures in enough detail that later researchers could understand the system's sophistication. But by the 1920s, operational knowledge was already fragmenting. The elders Stewart interviewed had learned the system as children or young adults in the 1860s and 1870s. They retained memorized protocols and could describe procedures, but the practical expertise, the intuitive understanding that came from years of actual operation, was largely gone. It's the difference between someone who learned a language as a child but hasn't spoken it in 50 years versus someone who uses the language daily. The memory is there, but the fluency is lost. Modern reconstruction efforts face similar limitations. Academic researchers, working with historical records and collaborating with indigenous communities, can understand the basic mechanics of smoke signal systems. They can recreate signal protocols and demonstrate that the techniques work. But achieving the full operational capability, the speed, precision, and coordination that made the historical networks effective, requires training and practice at a scale that no contemporary effort has attempted. What we can learn from historical records and experimental reconstruction is that smoke signal technology was far more sophisticated than popular understanding suggests. This wasn't primitive signaling. It was advanced communication, engineering that applied principles of atmospheric science, information theory, and network coordination that Western science didn't formalize until the 20th century. The information density achieved through multi-dimensional encoding using duration, spacing, timing, repetition, and fuel characteristics to pack information into brief signal sequences anticipated information theory concepts that Claude Shannon wouldn't formalize until the 1940s. The network design with redundant paths and alternate routing anticipated principles of resilient network architecture that became standard practice in military and commercial communication networks in the late 20th century. The security through cultural encoding anticipated cryptographic principles that remain relevant in modern information security. These weren't accidental parallels. They were convergent solutions to fundamental communication challenges. Indigenous engineers and Western engineers were solving the same problems: how to transmit information reliably over distance, how to encode information efficiently, how to secure information from interception, how to create networks that remain functional when individual components fail. The solutions differed in implementation details, but converged on similar principles because those principles are fundamental to communication, regardless of the specific technology used. The tragedy is that recognition of this sophistication came too late to preserve the knowledge systems intact. By the time Western researchers understood what they were looking at, the operational networks had been destroyed and the expertise was fragmenting. What survived in oral traditions and ethnographic records are shadows of what existed, enough to understand that it was remarkable, but not enough to fully reconstruct it. The broader lesson extends beyond smoke signals. Indigenous peoples across the Americas possessed extensive technological knowledge adapted to their specific environments. Agricultural systems that sustained large populations without depleting soil fertility. Water management systems that supported desert cities. Architectural techniques that created structures surviving for centuries. Medical knowledge that included antibiotics, analgesics, and surgical procedures. Astronomical observations that tracked planetary movements with accuracy, matching or exceeding contemporary European science. Most of this knowledge was dismissed or destroyed during colonial conquest. Some was appropriated without credit. Crops domesticated through millennia of indigenous plant breeding became economic foundations of European empires, while the scientists who developed them received no recognition. Some was partially preserved through documentation by anthropologists and historians, creating fragmentary records that hint at what existed. Most was simply lost when the social structures that maintained knowledge systems were disrupted or destroyed. The smoke signal story is particularly well documented compared to many indigenous technologies, which makes it valuable as a case study. We have enough evidence to understand in reasonable detail how the systems worked, what advantages they provided, why they were effective, and why they ceased to function. That evidence allows us to make specific technical and historical arguments rather than vague generalizations about lost knowledge. The technical sophistication is demonstrable. We can show that smoke signal networks transmitted information faster than telegraph networks over specific distances under specific conditions. We can explain the engineering principles that made this possible. We can document specific instances where the communication advantage translated into tactical advantage. These aren't claims requiring faith or cultural generosity. They're factual statements, supported by historical records, technical analysis, and experimental reconstruction. The historical importance is significant. The smoke signal networks influenced military campaigns, shaped settlement patterns, and affected the speed and direction of territorial expansion. They weren't marginal curiosities. They were operational communication systems that directly impacted historical events. Understanding those impacts requires acknowledging the system's sophistication rather than dismissing them as primitive signaling. The contemporary relevance is substantial. Communication network designers face challenges, resilience, security, efficiency, that indigenous signal networks solved through different methods than contemporary technology uses. Those alternative solutions offer insights that might inspire innovations in modern systems. The idea that networks can be designed for environmental integration rather than environmental domination, that security can come from cultural context rather than mathematical complexity, that resilience can come from simplicity rather than redundant infrastructure. These principles are worth examining, even if direct application isn't feasible. and the justice implications are unavoidable. When we understand that indigenous peoples possessed technological sophistication that matched or exceeded contemporary Western systems in specific domains, we're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how colonial conquest was justified and how history has been narrated. The civilizing mission that supposedly brought enlightenment to primitive savages becomes harder to defend when the savages possessed engineering knowledge that the civilizers didn't understand and couldn't replicate. This doesn't mean indigenous societies were perfect or that all traditional knowledge was superior to European alternatives. It means that technological sophistication takes different forms in different cultures, that evaluating technology requires understanding specific contexts and applications, and that assumptions about inevitable progress from primitive to advanced are problematic when examined against historical evidence. Jacob Hollings, watching those smoke signals in June 1862, was seeing something he couldn't fully comprehend because his cultural framework didn't provide the concepts needed to recognize what he was observing. He saw smoke. What he didn't see was centuries of engineering refinement, generations of training, atmospheric science applied through empirical observation, information theory encoded in cultural practice, and network coordination achieving performance that the telegraph couldn't match in that specific environment. His notes from that day survive in archives, sketches and descriptions that reveal his confusion and fascination. He was trying to understand, trying to find the logic that would let him decode what he was seeing. But the logic was embedded in cultural knowledge he didn't possess and couldn't easily acquire. Without years of training, without the conceptual framework that organized the information, without understanding the encoding protocols, the signals remained mysterious. Within a few years, they would remain mysterious permanently. By 1868, Shoshone bands in that region of Nevada were being forced onto reservations. The signal station network that had operated for generations was abandoned. The operators who maintained it were dispersed or confined to reservations where signal operations were impossible. The knowledge began its fade from living practice to historical memory. Some operators continued to remember the protocols, even when they couldn't practice them. In 1924, an anthropologist interviewed a Shoshone elder named Tom Weesaw, who had trained as a signal operator in his youth. Weesaw described the signal sequences, the timing protocols, the station locations across territory he hadn't seen in 50 years. His memory was clear, the knowledge was intact, but there was nowhere to use it. The stations were gone, the network was destroyed. The social context that made signal operations meaningful had disappeared. Weesaw died in 1927, taking with him decades of specialized expertise that no one else fully possessed. His knowledge represented the terminus of a training lineage that extended back centuries. When he died, that lineage ended. The protocols could be described from historical records, but the operational expertise, the intuitive understanding that came from years of practice, died with the last generation of trained operators. This pattern repeated across the continent. In every indigenous culture, specialists possessed knowledge systems refined through generations. When those cultures were disrupted or destroyed, the knowledge systems collapsed. What survived were fragments, oral traditions, archaeological evidence, written records created by outside observers. These fragments let us glimpse what existed, but not reconstruct it fully. The smoke signal networks of the Shoshone, Ute, Paiute, and other Great Basin tribes represented one of many indigenous technological achievements that were destroyed during American territorial expansion. They weren't the most complex or the most economically significant, but they were among the most directly comparable to contemporary Western technology, which makes them useful for demonstrating that technological sophistication existed in forms that colonial narratives didn't acknowledge. The telegraph didn't make smoke signals obsolete through technological superiority. Political and military power made smoke signals obsolete by destroying the social systems that maintained them. The distinction matters. When we understand that the outcome was determined by power rather than merit, we can ask different questions about technology, progress, and what was lost in the collision of cultures. We can also apply those lessons to contemporary situations where indigenous knowledge systems face threats from development, modernization, or cultural pressure. The smoke signal story shows that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive or obsolete can mean losing sophisticated solutions to problems that remain relevant. It shows that technological evaluation requires understanding context rather than assuming Western approaches are universally superior. And it shows that preserving knowledge systems requires preserving the social and cultural contexts that maintain them. The networks are gone. The operators are gone. The knowledge exists in fragments. But the story remains instructive. Jacob Hollings watched smoke signals transmit information 200 miles in 4 hours, while the telegraph line next to his route took 6 hours for the same transmission. That comparison should have prompted questions about assumptions, about what counts as advanced technology, about what civilization means. Instead, the comparison was ignored or dismissed because acknowledging it required challenging narratives that shaped how settlers understood themselves and justified their actions. A century and a half later, we can look back with clearer understanding. The smoke signals worked better than telegraph for specific applications in specific contexts. That's not opinion or cultural generosity. It's fact, demonstrated by historical records and technical analysis. Acknowledging that fact doesn't diminish the telegraph's revolutionary impact on global communication. It just recognizes that technological comparisons are more complex than simple narratives of primitive versus advanced. The Shoshone signal operators who transmitted that message Jacob watched in June 1862 were engineers working with sophisticated technology. They deserved recognition as innovators, as experts, as sophisticated thinkers who solved complex problems through centuries of refinement. They didn't receive that recognition in their lifetimes. The least we can do now is understand what they achieved and acknowledge that what was destroyed wasn't primitive signaling, but advanced communication engineering that Western civilization would have benefited from studying rather than dismissing. The smoke rose in 3 sharp bursts against the clear Nevada sky. Then 2 more bursts. Then nothing. The message had been sent and received and relayed across 200 miles of mountain territory faster than the telegraph could match. The technology worked exactly as it was designed to work, refined through centuries of observation and innovation. And within a few years, it would be gone. Destroyed not because it failed, but because the people who created it lost the power to maintain it. That's the truth about smoke signals versus telegraph. One system was often better on technical grounds. The other system won because it was deployed by the side that won the war. Understanding this distinction matters. It's the difference between believing that technological progress drives history and understanding that power drives history, while technology is just one tool in struggles that are fundamentally about who controls resources, territory, and the future. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Old West archives with us.